Hey guys, look what we have today. We have Midtone, who's one of the really iconic special characters from Necromunda back in the day. And today we're going to be just having a bit of fun with this miniature. I thought a bit of a nice palette cleanse would be good. Paint something from a setting other than Warhammer Fantasy for once. And yeah, Midtone is one of those interesting characters who was really representative of that entire miniature line. Just that kind of really interesting sort of unique underhive punk look that a lot of the Necromunda miniatures in first edition had. Um, I really like this model. It's done by Michael Perry, and you can sort of see that his attention to detail really shows in it. It looks like just really everything you want to stuff into that sci-fi trope of that Amazon woman. Uh, it's a bit of a dated concept, but I think it's executed extremely well and with really, really nice details. So, um, this model, to put it in context, would have been around the time of things like Tank Girl, would have been around, where, I mean, coming from the name, like Madonna's obviously, like the singer Madonna's obviously a reference, right? Madonna Yolante. So yeah, I think this model draws upon a lot of those tropes, which were really, really interesting for that period in the 80s and 90s. And to be perfectly honest, her backstory does as well, because her story is a bit of a cautionary tale, really. It's a case of what happens when you take a person and turn her into an object instead, and what happens when that person's mind then rebels, because her story is all about being locked up by her father, who's Sylvanus, patriarch of the Ulanti family, and she's supposed to be married off to Lord Coiron, who's one of the other uh, noble house leaders, and she's basically locked up in the spire to keep her chaste. And of course, you're really beginning to see that parallel with Madonna's sort of tropes, right? The idea that she's a virgin and she's gonna get flogged off to some nobleman to become her prize, like wife, his prize, his trophy wife, essentially. And yeah, it's a really nice little bit of storytelling, because she goes on and suddenly develops this fixation with beauty, and the idea of digging out eyes just becomes a trope that happens like multiple times in the story. The first time she digs out someone's eye, she basically does it to her husband to be, Lord Coiron, who I think has some. Yeah, no, I shouldn't speculate, but he reminds me of House Orlok for some reason, but I don't think there is a connection there. I might be wrong. I'll look it up. Yeah. So Madonna Yolante goes on to dig out his eye in the middle of dinner, just as everyone thinks that the wedding arrangement is going smoothly. Of course, it doesn't. Hint, hint. Spoiler alert. And she goes on and digs out his eye with what's called a silverfish fork. I assume silverfish are a certain kind of I don't know, underhive sardine, I suppose, but some kind of a delicacy. And she takes out his eye with a fork. And then the second time she does this, she actually digs out her own eye, which is, I guess, you're in the underhive. Maybe you don't need that perception. Or maybe you've got enough money to do bionics and replace your flesh and blood eye. But yeah, she goes on to dig out her eyes when one of her eyes when basically a barman basically says that she's pretty. And of course, that's really that kind of idea that if you are going to associate value with appearance, I guess at some point it gets a bit too much. And this poor girl goes on to lead a long and fruitful life, I guess, in the end, in the service of an Escher gang. But then she leaves and becomes eventually a hired gun in her own right, just as an individual traveling the underhive, looking for whatever it is that I guess inspired her to run away in the first place, because the story's not too clear on that. And that's what I really liked about the early Necromunda stories as well. Yeah, they give you a sort of a bit of a template, an interesting kind of lens through which to see this character. She's kind of clearly got a big story angle, this whole idea of appearance and objectification, which yeah, sure, I mean makes a lot of sense in her context because she was about to get married off to somebody that she obviously had no feelings for, and just the whole idea of being a bargaining chip really felt pretty bad for her. And then she goes on to find her own kind of freedom. So it's kind of nice little story. Uh, it's a far cry from empowerment. It's more rebelling against like really bad like situation and going on and figuring it out to whatever end, which kind of made it less of a more of a morality story for her house that hopefully learn that maybe you don't push people too far in this direction. Maybe, who knows? But yeah, it's a really nice little story and one with a clear sort of motive. So how she then goes on to figure into the story of your own warband or your own little Necromunda gang, and her motivations for joining you would be really up to you to decide. So you could decide that if you were playing against an Escher warband, or a rival Escher warband, you could say that it's because she wants to destroy something beautiful. As you can tell, I watched Fight Club not long ago. So yeah, just the idea that she has really unique motivations, or maybe any other gang fight that would sort of directly sabotage either House Yulanti or House Poiron, would be really nice as a way to continue her backstory. So yeah, really fertile ground for expanding the scope of your games, and I think that is the ideal way to treat special characters in any Games Workshop setting, which is that you've got a bit of a basic story hook, but ultimately the idea is that you go on to decide how you want to include these characters into your storyline. So her outfit is pretty interesting. I think that's probably the one thing that made her stand out the most on the tabletop was just the way she was dressed, and she has, I don't know, kind of like a safari inspired outfit because she's got these tiny little booty shorts. Cool, no issue there. But they're all covered in leopard print, and I guess that's the wildness expressed. She's also got these like conical breast plates, I guess would be the best way to describe them, and that's clearly a Madonna reference. So okay, kind of interesting visually, and really gives her a unique look on the table. She kind of has that kind of basic Escher vibe, but then dialed up to 11, right? Because she's so over the top and so crazy, and more than half of her body mass is hair, which is kind of awesome. I'm a huge fan of hair metal bands from the 80s, so there. Heart is the best, prove me wrong. Speaking of heart, she's got hearts all over her, and I guess that sort of extends the idea of forbidden love and what happens when you don't get to choose who you end up with. So that whole idea of freedom and liberation, very interesting, very punky, and very suitable for the whole Necromunda aesthetic. Really like this character and her backstory, and as much as I really wanted to get a hold of this miniature back in the day, she was really hard to come by because once more at this point, character models in general were not in high circulation simply because, well, you're not going to sell very many of these, unfortunately. Like maybe if you had a particularly committed like Necromunda group, maybe one or two people might own a copy of this model, but that would basically wipe out all of the stock for the country that you were in. And I'm from Singapore, right? So that's a tiny little proportion. That's a tiny amount of stock basically floating around the shops. So it's actually really hard to get hold of these models. So I am really blessed to be able to get this lady prepped and up on the tabletop. I guess one of the things that really comes across with this miniature is, I think Michael Perry kind of broke away a little bit from his usual mold. I mean, as you know, Michael Perry's a really celebrated historical style miniature sculptor, sorry. And this model kind of goes really outlandish in another direction, and I really like seeing that from him, simply because it's so different from what he usually does. that it kind of builds. I mean, it basically opened up a new avenue for me to consider his work, and that was very very appealing for me. Never, I only recently found out that this was a model of his, and that kind of genuinely surprised me because it's so different from his usual style. I'm putting in a bit of Gryphcharger grey on that sort of armband that she's got on. It's a kind of nondescript shred of clothing, maybe something from her Yulanti days, but you never know. She's also got this glove, and I think the whole idea behind this miniature is it's clearly mismatched, right? It's clearly a hodgepodge of styles, and I mean it all reflects her insanity. So that kind of is really compelling for me to paint because there are just so many different patterns and styles all over her body. Later on, we're going to be trying to do that sort of leopard print design on most of the yellow parts, the parts of the body that I have painted. What was it? It was Iaden yellow, as you can see on this miniature, and we'll be blocking those in with the leopard print design, but only when this is fully dry. You got to give it the best chance of success. Flesh, as usual, is my typical. What was it? It was Guilliman Flesh Seraphim Sepia to give you a slightly warmer flesh tone, which I enjoy very much. I think Guilliman Flesh out of the bottle might be a little bit too pink. Just a personal thing, but yeah, your mileage may vary. Use that if you will. I put the actual recipes, of course, into the description below. So let me know. You don't need to let me know if you want to use it, but if you want to refer to it, it's right down there for your ease of reference. So yeah, have fun with it. No need to credit me, of course. Just do whatever you will. Enjoy yourself. Cool. So Gryphcharger Grey this time cut with a bit of water to give a bit of color to this stocking. Again, building up that asymmetrical color. Don't mind me, I'm getting stuff out of my eye. Yeah. Ooh, that's particularly appropriate for this miniature, the idea of getting stuff out of your eye. But there we go. Okay, cool. So while all this is drying, let's move on to a bit of Doomfire Magenta and Volupus Pink. Volupus? Volupus? Volupus. Let's go with Volupus. So this gives us hopefully a color that I've never actually tried this, but let's see how it goes. Ooh, that's nice and vibrant. A bit strong though. So maybe we might cut it back a little bit. But yeah, as you would imagine, any model sort of inspired by Madonna has gigantic hair, and she certainly doesn't disappoint. So I'm just mixing a little bit of water in on the surface, just to take away a little bit of the extremity of the sort of extreme vibrance of the color. And I think that should suit our purposes fine. You're never gonna get this to the level that you want in your first pass, in my experience. So what I like to do is I just like to go with it. Apply the pink as you will, lightly, just give it an all over coat. Worry about getting it nice and even rather than anything else. And once this is more or less all filled in, you can come in with a deeper shade of purple or even the same color, but just this time uncut with medium or water, and then you can sort of blend it in to sort of get the kind of finish that you want before we even resort to one highlight. I like keeping highlights on hair to a very fixed small area, because when you think about it, painting hair in real life, or painting hair to look like real life, has a lot more to do with making it look almost metallic, like you're almost using non-metallic metal techniques to try to achieve a nice sharp highlight. Because in real life, hair is extremely glossy. It's very well oiled by our scalp, frankly, and yeah, so hair tends to have very small, very fine, very sharp highlights. Have a think about how silk is similar, right? Like silk has extremely metallic-like reflections, very very sharp and very small and very concentrated. Specular highlights, almost. I guess that's the technical term. That sort of little glint highlight. So yeah, that's the best way to approach hair in my experience. I don't want to basically spend too much time like putting on successive dry brushes, because in my opinion, every time you add white into a color to apply a successive highlight, it's essentially desaturating the highlight and weakening the color overall. So if you want to keep it nice and vibrant and intense, perhaps a better way to look at approaching that might be to try to shade it down instead, and then kind of do very, very selective specular highlights, just to make sure that the bulk of the model still has that nice vibrance that you want to have on a model that is, I guess, this vibrant and interesting. Yeah. So, lots of hair. Just got to scan around to make sure I don't miss any spots. To be fair, missing spots on this is going to be quite likely, since there's so much hair. But there you go. Just make sure that it's a nice even coat. It doesn't need to be, in fact, it's better if it's not full strength Volupus Pink and Doomfire Magenta. It's entirely okay if we come back in and we add intensity in the next coat. But for now, you just want to make sure that you cover everything in that initial pass. And of course, it helps you visualize the color scheme on the model. And I guess you can sort of take a cue on that when it comes to preparing what to do next. And I think being more, kind of deliberate with your color choices is a good way to improving the final look of a model. Okay, cool. So now she's got her bangs that we need to come in to do. I'm going to be a bit careful with this because this model is actually really fine, which is very characteristic of Michael Perry's work, with the exception that she's quite tall, actually. She's quite tall and large. For context, she's actually the same height as a Plague Marine of her era. So she is a tall lady, and that's primarily because she's got her heels going. Michael Perry is actually really good for scale and such. So I'm not going to say that it's because he made her bigger or anything like that. But she's got a really big pose, with arms and legs splayed apart to make her look taller. And of course, she's got the crazy heels, which basically adds at least half a head, if not more, to her height, so she looks more imposing. Yeah, making sure I get everything in the crevices, because there are plenty of crevices on this model. And as far as the hair is concerned, anyway, don't take that out of context. Yeah, this little sliver over here. And I think we are closing in on completion for this particular step, or at least as happy as I am to have it right now, before we come back in and add a lot more saturation and visual interest to the finish. Gotta go in between her little hair ties, of which she has 5 in total because her hair is split into 5 individual parts. And that's another thing that I really like about Michael Perry's work, right? That he has, just as far as the way he builds out his structures on the model, he's really good at making sure that there is a logic to the way the different areas overlap well. A lot of the Necromunda miniatures of the time sometimes look a bit messy and haphazard because they have a lot of different textures, especially if they are models who kind of occupy that hired sword kind of space. They tend to reflect their ability to cope with anything, I guess, the Underhive could throw at them, by just looking like a Swiss Army knife, right? All manner of gear and equipment festooned all over their bodies. Like Braca the Avenger, for example, the red skin special character, he's covered in ammunition, right? He's literally a bare-chested dude, but he's absolutely wearing bandoliers of machine gun ammo everywhere because he's armed with a heavy stubber. You've got Gary Morley's bounty hunters at this stage, and frankly, they've got everything they need to survive, from multiple weapons and pouches and equipment, blah blah blah, all over it. So the models look incredibly busy. Madonna doesn't. She's kind of nice in that sense because I think that's a testament to Michael Perry's style of not overburdening a miniature with detail, and I really appreciate that, especially when it comes to painting it on camera, because I think it's really nice that despite how small all the detail is, how fine it is, I can easily pick it apart and I pick it out on camera to do a hopefully decent job at rendering it. Cool. I'm gonna come in with a bit of red to detail the hearts that she's got going on. This is a motif that occurs in several places on this miniature. So the shoulder pad, where she's got curiously 2 and not 3. On the right side, I probably would imagine that there should have been 1 more heart, but for casting reasons, maybe that didn't survive. This model is also quite strange insofar as the arm, the left arm with the plasma pistol, surprisingly is separate from the rest of the model, despite it not being probably. I mean, I'm no expert, but I'm guessing it might have been possible to cast it as a one piece, but to achieve that nice sort of like sweeping outwards kind of angle, and basically preventing a miniature that kind of looks all in one line, which was very much a feature of miniatures in the day. Like, just think of the old Space Marine Scouts where they're holding their blades very clearly out to one side, or otherwise pointing with a pistol. That was just a very common pose in that period. She's got a pistol angle that's slightly this way, more to this direction, which is kind of nice. Yeah, but curiously, it meant that I feel like 1 heart didn't make the cut over there, right? You get 1 heart in the center, a big one, and then 1 smaller one to the side, but you're clearly missing 1 over there. So I'm not sure why. I'm not sure whether that was the reason, or there just never was a heart over there. I mean, that certainly could be the case, but it is what it is. We are here. I'm trying to figure out what's going on over there. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure. It probably looks like more hair. Although at this point there is a lot of hair on this model. So you know what? I'm just going to do it up as hair for now. And let the contrast paint tell me whether that's what hair looks like. Because it's not a hand. Her hand is behind that lock of hair. So I'm guessing that's probably just more of her hair, of which she has plenty. Okie dokie, let's move on. So let's look at applying a little bit of a highlight to her skin. This model, obviously, she's meant to look alluring and attractive. So there are small little windows of skin that need to be a major feature of this miniature, because that's just her theme, right? So letting her bare skin, which to be fair is quite unusual in the Underhive. I think she's certainly probably the least dressed out of all the Necromunda miniatures, even including the Necromunda Escher Juves, who are quite bare, with quite a bit of bare skin showing. I think she's probably the least dressed miniature in the range, for thematic reasons, and also to reinforce the whole idea of beauty and, freedom and all that kind of thematic background. So I'm gonna add in some quick highlights to make sure that these areas pop. My voice sounds funny now because I'm holding my breath. As always, when painting really fine details on the surface of a tiny miniature like this, well, she's not tiny as in height or size particularly, but she is very petite. It really helps to hold your breath to make sure the brush goes only where you want it to go, and not everywhere, making a huge mess, which is very liable to happen, to be perfectly honest. Cool. So I'm going to come in, put a little bit of white on her hair ties, because I can see that my magenta layer has kind of gone a little bit over and kind of muddied the shapes a little bit. So we'll come back with a bit more Gryphcharger grey to define that. I can see that I'm actually using a lot more Gryphcharger grey than I originally intended. But you know what? I think it's a really good counterpoint to the yellow, Yandan yellow, and magenta mix for the hair. So a little bit of coolness amidst all the super warm and vibrant colors. It's a really good way to sort of keep that in check, to make the model look a little bit more grounded and a bit more visually balanced and not so eye-aching to look at. Okay, so she's looking pretty good. I'm quite happy with the way this is turning out. One thing that's bothering me slightly is this little sort of nick on the weapon. I will clean this up with a bit of ice yellow as best I can, and then sort of edge the plasma pistol a little bit on the top edges, because let's remember that we're going to come in and put on that leopard print in a bit, as per the original 1990s artwork, which was iconic. Yeah, okay, so that heart needs to be brightened up a little bit because I completely thought it was part of the yellow. Just a particularly dark splotch. It doesn't read as a heart right now. Okay, so we'll look into that. Cool. Now she's got one leather boot, and for leather, you know, my go-to color is really Gore-Grunter fur. I really like the way this color works. It is nice and dark and saturated, but it's also not without personality. It doesn't read as a sort of nondescript, dingy sort of color. It's got nice saturation and a little bit of an appealing red-brown tone. So that's my leather color of choice for her leg, her boot. That goes up quite high on this thigh, and I really like the sort of difference in saturation that you get when you get Gore-Grunter fur coming up next to a patch of human skin, or in her case, this sort of mid Caucasian skin tone, which is as usual my Guilliman Flesh and Seraphim Sepia mix. So there we go. That boot's looking pretty good. Really like that contrast between the Gore-Grunter fur and her skin. That's looking pretty nice. I think the rest of the bits that she's got going on, I'll probably do in black, because I do want a little bit more contrast going. So let's go with some Black Templar and very carefully edge all of the areas that are currently still in the undercoat grey. She's got a knee thing. Probably do that in metal. Yeah, so let's do her corset in black, which is traditional. Sometimes you pick colors not because they're the best like mix for that area, but more because they read most as what they're supposed to be. So corsets look particularly good in that typical black leather or PVC, as the case may be. So in that case, I would still use the material that people are most likely to recognize it as. It's the reason why people paint purity seals with red seals, right? Not just because they're traditional, but because they're supposed to be wax. And a lot of medieval wax is actually a deep mahogany red or burgundy red, wine red as it were. So yeah, that makes the most sense because people would recognize that visually as what it is. So there are times when we make choices based on material and our ability to interpret the material, not necessarily because they happen to be the best for the color scheme. Yeah, but that's it. I mean, that red purity seal color turns out to be a really good choice because it tended to offset a lot of the color schemes of the day. A lot of Space Marines had bright primary colors, so in order for the purity seals to kind of look good and pop on the surface, it made sense to choose a color that was particularly vibrant so that they won't get lost amidst all the detail. And that's right, what these like miniatures do best, right? They're very judicious in their layout of detail, so that you are able to pick them out in different colors accordingly. Curiously, this part, the holster, it was done originally with pink hearts on a red background. I am actually changing this to black because I think it would just make the hearts look a little bit more readable. Let's see how this plays out. Hopefully it doesn't desaturate the model too much. My inclination is that it probably will be fine, and it means that we can really make the hearts a lot brighter. Hopefully with a few additional highlights later on. But for now, yeah, I think this is coming out okay. Top of the holster has that turned down sort of leather part, so that can be black as well. Really, when it comes down to adding black onto the surface, you are really trying to define individual areas to make sure that the model remains readable and sectioned correctly into parts based on some level of logic. So for that reason, I'm doing the strap on the back of the leg, as well as these leather strappy bits around the ankles in black first before I pick out the metal details. Cool. So the original model for this had the plasma gun done in a fairly old school style. The cooling area, the cooling vents were just that, they were just cooling vents. So they were done in silver, whereas I find a more recent way of treating plasma gun cooling vents is to do it in a nice bright glowy color, and I think that's something that I'm just going to have to emulate because I really like the look of that. So we will be doing that in a nice green, mostly because green doesn't occur anywhere else on this miniature, and it's just a kind of really vibrant way to add a bit of detail to the miniature, another point of interest, so to speak. And then I'm going to jump back in and fix some of the hair bits that I missed. It's amazing how you can paint a model like this and cover more or less every single angle, or think you have, only to find that there are areas that you completely missed. So as before, this is a combination of Doomfire Magenta and Volupus Pink, which is just a mix that I think has a lot more interest than just Volupus Pink on its own, because Volupus Pink on its own is really nice, but it's also really dull. We will use that as a shade later to add a bit more volume and shape to the hair. I'm not inclined to overly highlight it. I just want to have a bit of, attention paid to the volume. So what I'm doing now is I'm coming in with a little bit more of this blend to correctly express the volumes of the hair, to make sure that it makes sense from a volumetric perspective. So if it's a large enough piece that it kind of looks like it should have really deeper shadows under it, then that's what it needs to have to convey the right look. Okay, so we're going to move back into Gryphcharger Grey, and we're going to continue to refine the shading around the hands and around her fingers. Very carefully put some shadow around her fingers, and for the sort of lighter of the two boots, this side I put on Gryphcharger Grey, but only very lightly. I'm wondering whether I want to come back in and highlight that with a little bit of flesh tone, just something to mull over while I go back and address the highlights for the skin. That looks kind of bright, but that's okay. I prefer to, in a way, overshoot my highlights and then maybe come back in to address it with a bit of shade later on to help it all blend together, but at least achieve the high points, the intensity first. before you kind of cut back the highlight. In my opinion, that's a better idea than having a model that kind of looks under highlighted. So often you see a lot of paint jobs that look well rendered but look sort of washed out and pale next to other miniatures on the tabletop because the muted saturated tones are causing that model to be overshadowed by maybe less well rendered but just very vibrant miniatures. This is really particularly bad if you've got a miniature that features a lot of desaturated colors. Unfortunately, that can make your model look wan and weak on the tabletop or on the judge's desk, depending on what your particular painting jam is. Maybe you're a person who does competition miniatures, in which case you will be very familiar with what I'm talking about, because it's very easy for what is essentially a beautifully rendered model to be lacking punch on the judge's desk, and therefore for it to get lost during judging, which is really sad, right? Not where you want to be. So take the time to make sure that your colors are nice and punchy and vibrant. Limit the use of gray wherever you can, or black and white to either darken or lighten a color. My strong preference, for example, for highlighting yellow is to go to, say, Vallejo Ice Yellow or Dawn Yellow if you are more of a Games Workshop ecosystem kind of painter. Nothing wrong with that. In this day and age, I truly believe that there's almost no bad paint lines anymore. It's just a case of what specific features you enjoy more than others. So a bit of silver to do up these little spikes on her ankle bangle things. Very Chun-Li looking. Spiked bangles. These have got to be hell for you when you're like running, because I don't know about you guys, but when I run, my shins come into contact with one another when I'm trying to avoid things, or when I'm trying to be a little bit agile and dancing around objects. So just the idea that you've got what is essentially spikes on one ankle, the chances of abrading your other ankle or your other shin, as the case may be, nightmarish. Cool. Okay, adding this silver. Not much silver on this miniature though, which is also another nice change from doing miniatures which are a little bit more warlike. She definitely looks like she's wearing civilian clothing, which is really nice. Just a nice change from the kind of miniatures that I usually paint, like the Warhammer armies and so on. Little muzzle at the end. No, I don't drill up my gun barrels. I don't understand why people do that. Not when you can just paint them to look three-dimensional and not run the risk of ruining a miniature by putting a drill bit through what has to be some of the finest detail on a miniature on the muzzle of a gun. Sorry guys, I just don't do that. I just don't understand why anyone would want to set themselves up for what could be a spectacular failure if you were just to, be a little bit less careful for a moment with a drill bit. Yeah, no thanks. I'm not going to put myself through that kind of stress. Okay, so I've made a bit of a mistake while on my little rant. So that's over here. Got a bit of silver, and amazingly this silver is already dry. It dries really quickly, so I couldn't quite get it off with a wet brush. But no matter, just cleaned it up. And then add some highlights wherever they are needed on her shorts. And yeah, get these out of the way. They can be quite rough and loose. Worry more about the volumes of the shorts and whatever clothing that she's got on, as opposed to trying to edge highlight every single thing, because we are indeed going to come back and put on some leopard print later, or try to. I have no idea how that will go, so we'll see how it goes. Yeah, So just putting a little bit of a highlight on her matching breastplates. Fans of How to Train Your Dragons will know. And then a little bit on her shorts. Okay, yeah. Okay, I don't think that looks too bad. Yeah. I'm trying to figure out what to put on her armband. The armband. Let's do it in red. Keep the colors. There's already a lot of colors on the model, so maybe we want to not add another additional complication for the color scheme. Because sometimes it's hard to know when that one extra color just makes the model a little bit too over the top. Let's go in and put Mantis Warriors Green on the coolant thing. Don't really know what these are, to be perfectly honest. Coolant sleeve on that plasma pistol. It's a really easy way to make it look decent. Quick is just with a really nice vibrant green like Mantis Warriors Green, and to let that sort of sit. Cool. Knee pad. Forgot the knee pad. That should be silver as well. I'm gonna shade that down later. And the small amount of chains on her person, around her ankles. That's a not too subtle nod to her backstory, where she was essentially a prisoner. Yeah, stuff is not subtle. But you know what? Miniatures can't be too subtle, right? They kind of need to express the character's backstory, and in that sense, I'm perfectly happy with that. I think it's a good way to reinforce that message. Not message, I mean like reinforce the theme of the model. Because I think in the 80s, I think these were rarely expressed ideas as opposed to present day, or they were less expressed, I suppose. Not rarely. But yeah, I don't think there was a concerted effort to push any kind of a story, just other than this being this character's unique story, her unique struggle, and her unique set of experiences that leads her to really spectacularly violent action, which is kind of great. Kind of a great story, and definitely a welcome addition to Necromunda, because it elucidated, some of the inner workings of the noble houses, which, frankly, feature very rarely in the Necromunda story. They do so a lot more now, in my opinion. A little bit to the detriment of the setting, because I think the noble houses work best if you sort of think of them as decadent, kind of distant characters and figures, which are really ominous, really far away from the perspective of your ganger and your lowly underhive scum and scavies and so on. These noble characters would practically be subhuman or inhuman, might be a better way to put it. It's not that they were particularly debased or anything, they were just really an alien concept to your average ganger encountering them, which is why the whole spire narrative works so well, right? Because conceptually, spires are kind of awesome. Really like that storyline beat. The idea that you've got nobles who act as if what is essentially your underhive peasantry are practically animals, and they go down and hunt these the gangers for sport. It's a really nice idea, and it's another really cool insight into the way underhive hierarchy works, because the underhive loses meaning if you don't have the spires, because that shows you the flip side, the extreme ends of being human on Necromunda. And it's really nice that you could sort of catch little glimpses of both sides. But what I was hoping that they would do was to keep it subtle, because when you do it too much, it kind of feels like they aren't as distant and scary as before. And I don't really want to know about the motivations of your noble houses. I kind of want to keep them nebulous and a sort of slightly malign. I think the mystery is improved by the lack of telling. It's enough to know that their interests are so far from subsistence and survival that they are essentially an alien species to your gangers. And it's that uncanny valley that really works for me conceptually. I like the idea that they are so far removed from the day-to-day survival in the hive that they're practically not human or alien. And to be fair, the Citadel design team did lean very strongly into alien vibes when it came to expressing the way the Spirers looked. Spirers will be that other Underhive gang, well, not Underhive, but the other gang that clearly drew from the upper spires of the upper echelons of Necromundan society. And yeah, those miniatures look very, very alien to the point of being, I don't know, kind of like Howling Banshees, Swooping Hawks, kind of aspect warrior looking models, especially in the case of the Jakara with her mirror shield and dagger, look very much like a Howling Banshee. Your Aurus Spira, kind of looking like a modern day superhero. Kind of cool, actually. Really like that sort of trope. But yeah, your Underhive ganger, your average Underhive ganger, is your window into this world, and therefore I like the idea that you keep the noble houses and their shenanigans sort of perceived from a distance and a little bit nebulous and shadowy. And that strengthened the story to me, because as an Underhive person, I would know nothing about these squabblings and murderings and eye gouging and goodness, and I would care little about the kind of shenanigans that go on. It's way above my pay grade, right, as an Underhive Scum member. So there you go. Okay, so I am coming in to add a little bit more saturation into the skin. I like the idea that, yeah, she's highborn and everything, but she's taken the time to get all down and dirty in the muck, so she shouldn't be too fair-skinned and brittle. There we go. A little bit more gray where needed. Now, here's the fun part. Maybe a little bit of skin tone on her left stocking to try to suggest that translucency. I'm not sure how much this will come out on camera, but if it does just a little bit, that's good enough, because it needs to be subtle. This highlight isn't there to sort of jump out and grab your attention. It's just there to suggest that there is a human leg under there, and visually that adds a bit of interest. I'm a little bit wary of making the highlight too bright, because the fear is that if it's too bright and too desaturated, it will take away from the organic look of the leg. Ideally, you would want the Gryphcharger grey to stay in the shadows, providing that cool base tone, while having a little bit of the fleshiness. I think that looks okay. That's a decent mix between the two, I hope. I hope that comes out on camera. Yeah, alright. Cool. I'm gonna go in with a little bit of warp lightning. to define the lower edge of the plasma cell. We're calling it a cell now because I have no idea what to call them. Cooling vents. I don't know, one of those things. Warp lightning is wonderfully in the same color range, I feel, as Mantis Warrior's green, so works really well as a shading color. Coming back with a bit of Vallejo red. That's not good. Vallejo red to add a bit more clarity and shape to the hearts. Hopefully these will be a bit more readable after that. Shoulder pad heart. Ooh, plasma pistol heart needs work. Kind of a little hard to see. There we go. And the little clothy armband that she's got over there. Perhaps a memento from a previous fight. Or a compatriot long lost in battle. A little bit more noun oil. Again, as before, this is old noun oil. It's you can make old noun oil from new noun oil. How many times can you say noun oil fast? Yeah, so you can make the new, the old noun oil from the new stuff by adding a little bit of Black Legion, just to desaturate it, well, to intensify it a little bit rather, not desaturate it. Yeah. Okay, cool. So we have reached the point where I think I need to stop procrastinating from painting the leopard print. So let's see how this goes. I think what I'll do is I'll switch to a smaller brush to give me more chance of doing a good job with it on camera. So let's get some Black Templar and just very carefully make roughly circular smudges. When you paint these, I find it's best to try to leave some kind of a circular or roundish blob in the center of each, because there is that ancient, I don't know whether anybody actually would relate to this story, but there is an ancient Rudyard Kipling, remember him, before things got complicated? There's an ancient Rudyard Kipling story about how the leopard got its spots. Hopefully that's ringing a bell somewhere. But yeah, so he was an African writer, a British person in Africa essentially, which these days is not really in currency anymore. But yeah, the idea was that the leopard got his spots when an early human, the protagonist of the story, took 5 fingers like this, right, to make a pattern on the wet skin of a leopard. So it's kind of like a flowery shape, right, with a sort of little gap in the center. Yeah, I think that's probably the best way to express it, and hopefully make it recognizable. So I'm trying very hard not to make it so that I have to go back in to add yellow in the center, because I feel that's when the illusion is kind of lost. When you try to go in to paint the center again, the chances of messing it up are very, very high. Because if you use just the wrong shade of yellow for that particular part of the chainsword, very likely you will end up with something that looks like it was painted on afterwards, and that's not ideal. So there, a little bit more marking on the top, not much, just a little bit to remind us all that it's a three-dimensional object, and then a little bit more of a black line to define some of the recesses. I'm thinking really hard about how much effort I want to put into putting leopard print on her shorts as well. I feel like I have to, because I think that's part of it, but I'm going to keep the markings fairly small and just have a suggestion of it. This is always the challenge with doing like essentially a camouflage pattern on a miniature. It's very hard to strike that balance between too much and too little, because too much and the shape of the sort of like shapes of the form of the model gets kind of lost. Too little and it kind of looks like, you know, the pattern isn't suggested enough. So it's a really fine line to do, and frankly, the only way to sort of improve that trade-off, in my opinion, is to just give it a shot and to test it, because the reality of what is the right amount of surface area coverage for the camouflage pattern versus the camouflage field, that means that part of the model that's not camouflage pattern, of course, is very dependent on the individual model. So you kind of need to test it out, and there's kind of no shortcut for that, I'm afraid. You're gonna need to give it a try and see how that turns out, and test it out on a piece of paper if you have to. Adding some highlights now. As mentioned before, I'm going to concentrate the highlights only on the apex points. Basically, just treat it like a metallic model. Maybe don't use a fine detail brush to try brush it on the way I'm doing it, but it's okay. I'm kind of in the zone, and I'm kind of liking the way she looks so far, so I'm feeling happy. A little bit more pale pink as before. Concentrate the highlights on these raised points, and it's okay if you go a little bit overboard, because you can always come back in and sort of like cut back into the highlights later to make sure that the highlights are all in proportion, because that's the most important determinant of how the model looks, whether you're keeping things all in proportion and within human expectation. In many ways, when you paint a miniature, you're really just trying to emulate what the human brain already thinks it knows about similar materials. You're kind of drawing on the viewer's experience. So that goes back to the idea of, you know, the wax, like purity seal wax, needing to be a certain color, because the expectation from your viewer is that probably wax is red. If you're looking at the old-timey kind of candles that you're trying to reference, that seems to be the most appropriate color to use, which is why we can recognize chains as chains just even from the shape. We don't necessarily need to see them bright silver as well. So long as the shape is recognizable, our brains understand them to be chains, just as a reference shape, I mean. Cool. Perhaps a bit shading around her head and face. Yeah. So just as I mentioned, Warp Lightning, I like as a follow-on shade to Mantis Warriors Green. I like to use Gore Grunter Fur as a follow-on shade for Flesh. So if there are parts of a model that I feel require a little bit of a darker shade, I like using Gore Grunter Flesh for that reason. Gore Grunter Flesh has the right range, I feel. Really most appropriate color to use in that context to shade down Flesh further. A little bit more black around her corset and this funny little underarm area, which we will keep mercifully dark. I did consider changing, the tone of her outfit initially because, well, frankly, the contrast between the flesh tone and this sort of yellow color would not, in my opinion, be too strong. But I've since changed my mind. I think it looks decent. It only needs a bit of a black shade around the edges or a dark colored shade. Doesn't need to be black, I suppose. Although in this case I did certainly use black because I was being quick. Okay. So, okay, we are, in my opinion, kind of doing alright. I think this model has really fine details, so it kind of bears a little bit of extra care and attention to make everything look correct. But I think we are a little bit patient, kind of put in colors where they need to be. Right now, I'm putting a little bit of ice yellow mixed with Yandan yellow to create some spot highlights, because I think the sort of volumes of the wrinkles and edges of the yellow kind of got lost after the leopard print went on, which is to be expected really, because as with all kinds of camouflage, and yeah, leopard print's a kind of camouflage, right, for a big cat anyway. It tends to kind of cause the eye to lose focus. That is indeed its intended purpose in nature. But the idea of painting a miniature to look good as opposed to actually camouflage, it's a very fine line to tread, and it's easy to fall afoul one way or another. I find that the best way is, like I mentioned earlier, to just test your color scheme on paper first, and also to use more vibrant colors than you think might be appropriate necessarily for camouflage. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, you're trying to make a model both camouflage and readable, which is really a contradiction in terms. But it's also not impossible to do with a bit of care. So yeah. At the end of the day, your pattern, your camouflage pattern, needs to respect the geometry of the surface of the model. So if, for example, there is a raised edge, that raised edge would need to basically pass through that camouflaged area, and it would need to be painted as such. So the raised edge will pass through both the light and the dark parts of your camouflage. So to make sure that works, you have to make sure that both of those areas receive an equivalent highlight. just to make the volumes look correct. I'm coming in with a bit of a black highlight. This is an often overlooked stage, but in my opinion, highlighting your black is a good way to make sure that it doesn't cause the details to be lost. And to be honest, black is such a wonderfully dark color that a few strokes of gray where they are needed most does a great deal to elevate the look of that area without losing the kind of depth of color. So it's one of my favorite steps. Back on the heels. She's got this wonderfully long heels. Tall heels, rather. Long heels would be a bit strange. And then for that strap and the other edge of her holster, and I think she's looking pretty good. A bit of that black armband that she's got going. Again, I imagine these are mementos from earlier fights that she had. Maybe even the remnants of old injuries. The girl has been fighting a war. So I'm going to put a little bit of ice yellow into the red, and just to give the hearts a little bit more definition. A little bit more on her pistol heart. It's probably the hardest to see out of all the hearts so far. Coming in with a little bit of Eandon yellow. Harden the edges around it, and to reinforce the shading on the weapons as well as on her shorts. So yeah, I guess for all parents out there, the moral of the story for Matt, Donna, Yolante is don't lock up your kids. Let them have friends. Let them discover the world in their own way so that they come back to you when they're in need of advice or a friend. And so you can be that friend, because parenting is a lot easier if you've got a pair of eyes and not one, because this lady is gonna dig them out if you try anything funny. Okay, so I think that's kind of where we are at now. I think I could go on forever adding more highlights, as is always my way, but for now, barring a little bit more on the gray to give it a bit more of a shape, I think this is where we are going to call it. Okay, really call it. Yeah. Okay, thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoy yourself, and I hope you enjoyed watching me paint this mini. Have fun. Cheers! And the back.